What would you do if everything you thought was real, your marriage, your family, your future, turned out to be a lie? One night was all it took to shatter my world, and nothing could have prepared me for what came next. It all started during this long drive to my dad's place. Ava and I were heading up there, and the hours on the road gave me way too much time to think. You know those moments when you're stuck in a car for ages, and your mind just starts wandering into places you'd rather not go? That was me. And where did my thoughts land? Right on my marriage. Ava and I got married young, way too young, to be honest. I was 23, and she was only 22. We barely knew what we were getting into, but at the time, we thought we had it all figured out. Anyway, the trip was to visit my dad, Carl. He's 45 and, believe it or not, about to get married again. It's his second marriage. My mom passed away years ago after a long fight with cancer, and now he's tying the knot with Diana. Fun fact, Diana's actually older than him by 4 years, she's 49. I didn't understand it. After everything with Mom, you'd think he'd just want to enjoy the rest of his life in peace, right? But no, here he was, jumping headfirst into another marriage like he hadn't learned a thing the first time. And then there was Diana. She's got a daughter, Erin, who's 27 and married to this guy, Luke. Nobody seems to know Luke's age, and honestly, no one cares. The guy's got this vibe, like a mystery you don't really want to solve. So, there I was, staring out the car window while all these thoughts about Ava and me started swirling around in my head. We'd been married for just over a year, and already things didn't feel right. We argued constantly, and it was always over the dumbest stuff. I'd leave a dish in the sink, and Ava would snap about it, or she'd pick apart something I said, and next thing I knew, we'd be in some stupid shouting match. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, there were times I wondered if we'd rushed into this whole thing. But maybe that's just what happens when you're young and think you've got life all figured out. As we drove, the question was weighing on me so heavily I finally turned to her and asked, "Do you think we rushed into getting married?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she gave me that look, like she was carefully weighing her response, knowing anything she said might set me off or lead us down a path we couldn't come back from. After a long pause, she said, "Ryan, we're fine. Marriage isn't easy, but we'll get through it together, right?" I nodded, but her words didn't sit right with me. It didn't feel fine. Maybe I was reading too much into everything, or maybe it was the way Ava had been pulling away from me lately, making me doubt everything we had. The truth was, she wasn't the Ava I'd fallen for, and I couldn't shake that feeling. When we finally got to my dad's house, the place was immaculate, almost too perfect. It had that air of a home that looked good on the surface but hid way too many secrets behind its polished walls. My dad, Carl, came out to greet us, his grin almost painfully wide, like he was trying to sell himself on the idea that this wedding was exactly what he wanted. Diana followed close behind, wearing the same forced smile, both of them pretending everything was better than it actually was. Then there was Erin. She barely acknowledged me or Ava. She was distant, guarded, as if she had no interest in being part of this so-called blended family. I couldn't blame her, I felt just as disconnected. The whole situation felt fake, like we were all part of some awkward play, acting out roles no one believed in. Dinner that evening was tense. Every word felt strained, like everyone was carefully choosing what to say to avoid setting off a powder keg. The conversation stayed light and meaningless, no one daring to bring up the obvious, that this wedding was happening way too fast and none of us really knew Diana. Erin stayed quiet, staring at her plate most of the time, while her husband, Luke, barely looked up from his phone. It was like he'd mentally checked out before dinner even started. Ava, on the other hand, put on a good front. She laughed at the right moments and made polite conversation, but I knew her well enough to see through the act. She was trying so hard to appear supportive, to play the part of the doting wife, but the cracks were there. Our relationship was slipping, and neither of us wanted to admit it. That night, we retreated to our room upstairs. Staying overnight had seemed like a good idea when we planned it, but now, it felt like a mistake, a decision that was only going to make an already uncomfortable situation even worse. I couldn't sleep that night. My mind was on a relentless loop, replaying the last few months, the arguments, the cold silences, the way Ava would be glued to her phone at odd hours. I hated even letting the thought cross my mind, but a part of me wondered if there was something going on that I didn't know about. Was I being paranoid? Probably. I figured I was just projecting my own doubts about us onto her. Still, that sinking feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. At one point, I leaned over in the dark and asked her softly, "Are we really okay?" She didn't respond right away. For what felt like an eternity, she just stared at the ceiling, completely still. Then, without a word, she rolled over to face the wall and muttered, "We're fine, Ryan. Just go to sleep." Fine. Sure. That was supposed to reassure me. It didn't. The next morning, the tension lingered in the air, thick and unspoken. Everything about the house felt off, whether it was the awkwardness between all of us or just my own thoughts running circles in my head, I couldn't tell. I needed to get out, to clear my mind, so I decided to step outside for some fresh air. That's when I saw Erin. She was already sitting on the porch, cradling a mug of coffee, staring off into the distance. She looked just as lost in thought as I felt. I hesitated for a second, but then I walked over and sat down. It wasn't long before we were talking, and, predictably, the conversation shifted to our parents' whirlwind romance. "They barely know each other," I said, shaking my head. "I mean, I want Dad to be happy, but this feels rushed. Like they didn't think it through." Erin nodded, her expression mirroring my own frustration. "Exactly. My mom never even mentioned dating after my dad died. And then, out of nowhere, bam, she's married again." She paused, staring into her coffee cup like it held all the answers. "It just doesn't feel right." I agreed, and for a while, we just sat there in shared silence. Maybe it was because she seemed to be grappling with the same kind of confusion I was, or maybe I just needed someone to talk to, someone who wasn't Ava. Either way, I found myself opening up. I told Erin about the doubts that had been gnawing at me, about how I couldn't shake the feeling that Ava and I were barely holding it together. I'd been wrestling with the doubts about my marriage for a while, how Ava and I had rushed into things, how young we were, and how what we had now felt so far from what we used to share. "I get that," Erin said softly, breaking into my thoughts. "Dave and I don't even know what's happening anymore. He's been acting so strange, so distant. It's like I don't even know who he is." There was something in her voice that made me pause. It wasn't just sadness, it was tinged with suspicion. I didn't press her for details, but she must have sensed I understood where she was coming from, because she kept talking. She told me about the late nights at work, the way Dave would come home smelling faintly of perfume that clearly wasn't hers, and how protective he'd become of his phone. The signs were all there, classic, unmistakable. She didn't need to spell it out for me. It was obvious she suspected him of cheating. Her words hit me harder than I expected. I hated even thinking it, but I couldn't help wondering if I should be paying closer attention to Ava's behavior too. The rest of the day dragged on, that conversation replaying over and over in my head. I felt restless, uneasy, like I was teetering on the edge of something I didn't want to confront. That's when it happened. I was outside again, trying to clear my head, when I saw her. Ava. And she wasn't alone. My breath caught in my throat as I watched her lean into another man, a man I recognized instantly as Luke, Erin's husband. At first, I thought maybe I was overreacting, that it wasn't what it looked like. But then it happened. They kissed. And this wasn't some innocent peck on the cheek, it was something deeper, something unmistakably intimate. The kind of kiss I hadn't seen from Ava in what felt like ages. My heart plummeted. It felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs, leaving me gasping and hollow. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I just stood there, frozen, watching as the woman I loved unraveled everything we'd built right before my eyes. It was like a gut punch, sharp and merciless. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. My feet felt glued to the ground, my body betraying me in my moment of greatest need. I don't know how long I stood there, it felt like forever, though it was probably only a few seconds. Finally, something inside me broke, and I turned away. My chest felt tight, my legs unsteady, but I forced myself to walk back to the house. It was like I was on autopilot, my hands trembling as I struggled to keep my emotions from spilling over. The last thing I wanted was for anyone to notice something was wrong, but inside, I felt like my entire world had just crumbled. I wasn't ready to confront what I'd seen, not yet. So I forced a smile, one I didn't feel at all, and walked back inside, pretending everything was fine. Of course, it wasn't. My chest felt tight, and I knew I wouldn't be able to keep this to myself for long. Erin was the only person who would understand, the only one I could tell, but the thought of saying it out loud felt impossible. Once the words were spoken, they'd make everything real. Later, while everyone else was distracted, preparing for dinner, I saw my chance. Erin was in the kitchen, moving around aimlessly, like she was trying to keep herself busy. My heart was racing as I stepped in and sat down near her, trying to figure out how to start. She noticed me and paused, giving me a look. "Ryan, you okay?" she asked cautiously. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. My voice came out low, barely audible. "I saw something today," I said, carefully choosing my words. "Something I wish I hadn't." Erin turned to me fully, her expression filled with both curiosity and concern. "What do you mean?" she asked softly. I hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. Finally, I found the courage to say it. "It was Ava and Luke," I said, my voice shaky. "I saw them outside, kissing." Her face went pale. She stood there, frozen in disbelief, her lips slightly parted as though she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. The silence stretched on, and I wondered if I'd made a mistake. Then, after what felt like forever, she let out this bitter laugh, not the kind that comes from amusement, but the kind that's sharp and painful, like someone who's just had their worst suspicions confirmed. "I knew it," she said finally, her voice trembling with anger and hurt. She stared down at her coffee cup, her grip tightening around it. "I've been telling myself I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew." I nodded, not sure what else to say. "I thought you should know," I murmured, my own voice faltering. She looked at me then, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and heartbreak. "Thank you," she said quietly, though her tone carried more pain than relief. "Thank you for telling me. I guess part of me didn't want to know the truth." There's a strange comfort in denial, even when everything in your gut is telling you otherwise. But at the same time, knowing felt better than losing my mind over the endless suspicions. As Erin and I leaned against the kitchen counter, there was an unspoken connection between us, a shared understanding of betrayal. It was twisted, sure, but it was something. For the first time, I didn't feel completely alone in this nightmare. We started to talk, really talk. Erin opened up about her marriage to Luke, how it had always felt a little off, even before they got married. "I don't think I ever truly loved him," she admitted, her voice heavy with regret. "Not in the way you're supposed to love someone you're marrying. I keep thinking maybe we rushed into it. Maybe neither of us was ready for this." There was something oddly comforting about hearing her say that, knowing someone else was struggling through the same kind of hell I was. It felt like we were both drowning in our respective miseries, but at least we weren't drowning alone. Time seemed to blur as we stood there, spilling our frustrations and regrets, airing all the anger and sadness that had been building inside us. The kitchen became this strange little bubble, completely detached from the rest of the house. It was just the two of us, trapped in this shared sense of betrayal and loss. Then Erin said something that completely floored me. If they can do what they want, why shouldn't we get something out of this too? Her words hit me like a jolt. My heart was pounding, and I didn't know how to respond. That wasn't where I thought this conversation was going. But as crazy as it sounded, I understood what she meant. The temptation was there, gnawing at me. The pull to do something, anything, to escape the overwhelming hurt and anger was almost unbearable. "We're both hurting," she continued, her voice soft but insistent, like she was trying to convince both of us. This could be our way out. Or at least a way to feel something. There was desperation in her words that matched my own. I felt this undeniable pull, this need to push past the pain and betrayal, even if it was just for a fleeting moment. Before I could process what was happening, we were moving closer, the weight of our shared misery pulling us together. And then, it happened. The space between us disappeared, and we were tangled together, a storm of anger, grief, and the desperate need to feel anything but heartbreak. It wasn't about love or even attraction, it was about escape, pure and simple. As things heated up, it was like all the betrayal and frustration boiled over, consuming us in the moment. Looking back, I'm not sure whether it was desperation, revenge, or something else entirely. All I knew was that for a brief moment, the pain didn't feel so suffocating. I realized in that moment that what was happening between Erin and me wasn't just about revenge. It was more than trying to even the score with our spouses. This was about taking back a shred of control in a situation that had completely unraveled our lives. It was messy and wrong, but it felt like a way to reclaim some power, a desperate attempt to make a choice when everything else felt so out of our hands. We had just moved into the bedroom when the door flew open, and there was Ava, standing in the doorway. Her face twisted in disbelief and rage as she took in the scene. "Are you kidding me, Ryan?" she screamed, her voice trembling with fury. Before I could even process what was happening, she stormed into the room, fists clenched at her sides. Her eyes were wild, locked on me with a mix of hurt and anger. "You're cheating on me. With her." The absurdity of the situation hit me like a punch to the gut. Ava was accusing me of cheating. After what I'd seen just hours earlier, her and Luke in the backyard. For a moment, I didn't even know how to respond. The sheer hypocrisy of it left me reeling. "You're calling me a cheater?" I shot back, my voice sharp with disbelief. "I saw you, Ava. I saw you with Luke." I half expected her to deny it, to gaslight me and try to twist the truth. But instead, she crossed her arms, her expression growing even harder. There wasn't a trace of guilt on her face, just frustration and bitterness. "You don't get it," she spat, her voice shaking. "You're always so wrapped up in your own world. You don't pay attention to me, Ryan. I've been lonely for months. I've tried to talk to you, but you're always too busy, too distracted. What was I supposed to do? Just sit there and feel invisible while you ignore me?" Her words stung, but they only fueled my anger. "Unhappy?" I shouted, my voice trembling with fury. "Maybe if you weren't sneaking around behind my back, things could have been different. But no, you had to ruin everything. You had to betray me." The tension between us was unbearable, suffocating. For a moment, it felt like the entire world had shrunk down to just the two of us, locked in this explosive, emotional standoff. I was shaking with anger, and I could see that Ava wasn't backing down either. Her frustration and hurt were as raw as mine, but neither of us could break the cycle of blame and fury. Before I could say anything else, Erin, who had been silently watching the argument unfold, suddenly stepped in. Her voice was sharp and deliberate, cutting through the chaos. But before she could say much, the door swung open again, and Luke appeared. His expression shifted immediately as he took in the scene, his eyes darting between Ava, Erin, and me, piecing together the mess he'd just walked into. "What the hell is going on?" Luke asked, his voice unsteady as he stared at each of us, confusion written all over his face. Erin turned on him like a hawk, her anger honed to a fine point. What's going on? How about the fact that I know you've been sneaking around behind my back, with her? She jabbed her finger toward Ava, her voice rising with every word. Luke's face went pale, all the color draining from him. Aaron, Don't, Aaron snapped, cutting him off before he could stammer out an excuse. Her voice was ice-cold now, steady and full of venom. I don't want to hear it, Luke. Ryan told me everything. He saw you and Ava sneaking around. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? I didn't, Luke started, but Aaron wasn't having it. Don't lie to me, Luke. You stopped caring a long time ago. You gave up on us, and now this? As their fight escalated, their voices clashing with raw anger and betrayal, I turned back to Ava. She was watching them argue, her face a mix of anger and something else, maybe regret. But at that moment, I didn't care. I couldn't keep this going, not anymore. I'm done, Ava, I said quietly, my voice thick with emotion. I can't do this anymore. I don't trust you, and I don't want to be with someone who can look me in the eye and lie like you did. She didn't respond right away. Her eyes darted toward me, and for a moment, I thought she might say something. But then she just looked away, silent. Her shoulders sagged slightly, like she had already accepted the inevitability of what was happening. I couldn't stand to look at her anymore. I turned my focus back to Aaron and Luke, who were still hurling accusations at each other. The room was charged with so much anger and heartbreak that it was almost unbearable, and all I wanted was to get out of there and leave this whole mess behind. I saw the realization hit my dad, Carl, like a freight train. He pieced it together quickly, his expression falling as he took in the wreckage of the scene. Diana stood beside him, frozen in shock, her horror playing on her face. Everyone needs to calm down, Carl said, stepping into the middle of the chaos, his hands raised like he could somehow stop what had already unraveled. This is getting out of hand. But it was far too late for that. The damage had already been done. Ava and I were broken, shattered beyond repair. Aaron and Luke were finished, their relationship dissolving in the aftermath of exposed lies. Even Carl and Diana, who had just been starting their new life together, seemed shaken by the fallout of what they'd walked into. When the shouting finally stopped, all that was left was silence. The room felt hollow, like it couldn't hold the weight of everything that had been said and done. No one spoke for a long time. It was like we'd drained ourselves dry, wringing out every last bit of anger, pain, and frustration until there was nothing left. We were just wreckage now, broken trust, broken relationships, and broken people. I stood there, staring at Ava, and all I felt was emptiness where love used to be. Maybe that was the hardest part, not the betrayal, not the lies, but the cold realization that what we had wasn't real anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. And now, standing face to face, there was nothing left to hide behind. She lifted her eyes to meet mine, and they weren't angry anymore. Instead, they held a resigned sadness, one that mirrored my own. I know, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I've known for a while. I just didn't want to admit it. I nodded. There wasn't anything more to say. We'd both been living in denial, clinging to the idea that we could fix something that had been broken from the start. But after everything, there was no point in pretending anymore. I'm going to file for divorce, I said finally, the words tasting bitter on my tongue but feeling strangely right, too. It's over, Ava. She didn't argue, didn't plead. She just nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. We both knew this was the end. There was no going back, no salvaging what we'd let fall apart. Later, as I stood in the quiet aftermath of it all, Aaron joined me. We were both trying to process the wreckage we'd been dragged through, each of us just beginning to figure out how to crawl out of the mess. I can't do this with Luke anymore, Aaron said softly, almost as if she were talking to herself. But her words carried a weight, a determination that was impossible to miss. I should have left him a long time ago. This affair, it's just a symptom. Our marriage was doomed long before this. I looked at her, and I could see the pain etched in her expression, but there was something else there, too, acceptance. Like me, she had finally come to terms with the truth. This wasn't just about what had happened, it was about the deeper cracks that had been there all along, the ones we'd ignored until they couldn't be ignored anymore. Hearing Erin say it out loud felt like an echo of my own thoughts. We'd all been clinging to this strange, comfortable denial, pretending that if we tried hard enough, if we just patched the cracks, we could find happiness again. But sometimes, there's nothing left to save. Sometimes, the only way forward is to walk away. I'm leaving Luke, Erin said, her voice steady, resolute now. I don't know what's next, but I can't stay in this mess anymore. It's over. Before I could respond, Carl and Diana walked into the room. They stopped short, immediately sensing the heavy tension in the air. What's going on? Carl asked cautiously, looking from Erin to me, and then back again. I ran a hand through my hair, letting out a heavy sigh. Ava and I are done. Erin's leaving Luke. And honestly, I don't even know where to begin with all of this. Carl's face fell, the weight of the moment hitting him hard. Diana looked stricken, as if she was holding back tears. I guess they'd hoped this marriage of theirs would bring everyone together, creating some big, happy blended family. Instead, it had done the exact opposite. It had torn everything to shreds. Carl turned to Diana, his expression filled with doubt. Are we doing the right thing? He asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe this was a mistake. Diana's lip trembled, and for a moment, she didn't answer. Then, she nodded softly, her eyes full of unshed tears. I don't know, she admitted, her voice breaking. Maybe we rushed into this. Carl exhaled slowly, as if the words had finally lifted a weight he'd been carrying. Maybe we need to take a step back, he said, reaching out to take Diana's hand. Figure out what we really want before we move forward. It was like watching another ripple in the aftermath, their doubt mirroring everything Erin and I had been feeling. This wasn't just about failed relationships, it was about all of us facing truths we'd been avoiding for too long. I don't want us to end up like them, Diana said softly, her voice trembling. Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, a quiet acceptance washing over her. Maybe you're right. Maybe we need to figure out what we really want, apart from all of this. I watched the moment unfold, seeing the cracks between them as clear as day. They were breaking too, but it wasn't loud or explosive like the rest of us. It was quiet, almost tender, yet no less painful. And in that moment, I knew. My dad and Diana wouldn't last either. By the time the night was over, everything would have shifted for all of us. By the end of that chaotic night, Ava was gone, and so was everything we'd built, or thought we had. Erin had decided to leave Luke, and my dad and Diana were left questioning the future they had rushed into. Everything I'd known for the past few years had been turned upside down. As terrifying as it was, I also felt an odd sense of peace. Sometimes, endings are the only way to start over. Now, months later, that night feels like it happened in another lifetime. It's funny how time moves differently when you're busy picking up the broken pieces of your life. When the dust finally settled, Ava was gone, and with her, the marriage, the plans, and the future we thought we had. It was painful, sure. But in that space where everything had fallen apart, there was room for something new to begin. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. At first, I kept wondering what I could have done differently, replaying everything in my head like some kind of punishment. But as time went on, something shifted. I started to feel okay. The loneliness that had terrified me in the beginning slowly transformed into something else, freedom. I wasn't tied down anymore. I didn't have to constantly navigate someone else's moods or tiptoe around their opinions. It was just me now, and strangely enough, that started to feel good. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking on eggshells, bracing myself for the next argument or blow-up. My life was mine again, and I was in control. It was a strange feeling at first, but it didn't take long to realize how much I'd missed this sense of independence. I also started reconnecting with things I'd forgotten I loved, or maybe things I'd never given myself the chance to try. One of those was playing guitar. There was something about those quiet evenings on my balcony, gently strumming the strings, that just felt right. It wasn't about being good at it, I was far from that. But it was peaceful, almost therapeutic. It gave me something to look forward to, something that was entirely mine. Then there was running. I'd never been much of an athlete, but I needed a challenge, something to keep me moving forward. So, on a whim, I signed up for a marathon. At first, I couldn't even get through a couple of miles without feeling like my lungs were going to give out. But little by little, it got easier. Each run was a small victory, and with every step, I felt stronger, like I was finally running towards something instead of away from it. I felt like I was shedding an old layer of myself, the version of me that had been stuck in a toxic cycle, weighed down by expectations and conflicts that never seemed to end. The person I was becoming felt lighter, freer, like I was finally stepping into the life I was meant to live. A few months later, I reached out to Erin. I was curious about how she was doing. When we met up, it was different. We'd both changed, each of us having gone through our own personal storms, but somehow we'd come out stronger on the other side. We sat there and talked for hours about everything, the fights, the divorces, the chaos our lives had become. But the anger and bitterness were gone. In their place was a quiet acceptance. "I don't regret any of it," Erin said, staring down at her coffee cup, her voice steady. "Yeah, it was awful. But I needed it. I needed to see how far off track I'd gotten. Leaving Luke was the best decision I could have made." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Whatever bond we shared wasn't romantic, it was something else entirely. It was like we'd both survived the same storm and were finally standing on dry land, looking back at the wreckage. It wasn't about love or attraction, it was about mutual understanding, a connection built on the simple fact that we'd been through the same kind of hell. We stayed in touch after that, but it never became anything more than a friendship. And honestly, I was okay with that. I didn't need anything else. For the first time in my life, I didn't need anyone else to feel complete. I was finally okay being on my own. For the first time in my life, solitude didn't feel like failure or loneliness, it felt like freedom. I didn't need to constantly shape my life around someone else or worry about whether I was enough for them. It was just me now, and for the first time, that was more than enough. My dad, Carl, and Diana didn't make it either. Not long after my divorce, they ended up going their separate ways. I think the chaos and heartbreak that came with their rushed marriage was just too much for either of them to handle. They'd thought they could build a new life together, but in the end, it only brought more cracks to the surface. Watching them try, and ultimately fail, made one thing clear to me: some endings are necessary, no matter how painful they might feel in the moment. These days, my life is quieter, more grounded. I've learned to enjoy the simple things I used to overlook. Most evenings, you can find me sitting out on my balcony with my guitar, letting the cool evening air settle over me as the sun dips below the horizon. The sky shifts from soft pinks to fiery oranges before fading into the deep blue of twilight. There's something about those moments that feels sacred, like I'm finally giving myself permission to just be. I'm still not a great guitarist, not even close, but that's not the point. Strumming the strings, playing a few clumsy chords, gives me a sense of peace I hadn't known I needed. It's my time, my space, and something that's entirely mine. And as I sit there, I think about everything I've been through. The fights, the betrayals, the heartbreak, it all feels like it happened to someone else, a version of me that doesn't exist anymore. I'm not the same person I was when all of this started. I've grown, become stronger, more sure of who I am and what I want. Ava is gone, and with her, all the weight of a relationship that had been breaking me long before I even realized it. Erin has moved on too, rebuilding her life in her own way. Even Carl is trying to figure out what's next for him, piecing together his plans one step at a time. And here I am, on my own. The funny thing is, I'm not scared of it anymore. In fact, I've come to embrace it. Being alone isn't a void to fill, it's a canvas. I get to decide what my life looks like now, without compromise or hesitation. That realization has been one of the most freeing and empowering feelings I've ever known. As the sun slips below the horizon, the sky bathed in rich, warm tones, I let my fingers glide over the strings of the guitar, playing for no one but myself. It's in moments like this that I truly understand how far I've come. I'm not chasing after something or someone anymore. I'm just here, present in the moment, and at peace with where I am. This is my life now, and for the first time, I wouldn't trade it for anything.